let's start with the last presentation of the day, and after that I have some preparation with capstone experience students in international studies. But you know, that's not a presentation per se, it's more of an exercise for our students. So I take great pleasure in introducing Professor Paul Diehl, a scholar in international relations. He is the Henning Larsen Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and the Archibald Smith Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Texas, Dallas. Excuse me. He previously was an Associate Provost and Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Texas, Dallas. He served as Director of the Correlative War Project, the largest data collection effort on international conflict in the world. He received his PhD in political science at the University of Michigan in 1983. Of course, you can find out more information. It's a full page over there in the program that I put together. But without further ado, with the presentation, The World in 2050, an Optimistic Assessment, Professor Paul Diehl.
Okay, thank you. If you can hear me, I'm not used to standing beside a podium, you know, where they tie something to you and you can only go so far for that. So if you will sort of indulge me a little bit, as long as you can hear me sort of in the back. Good. All right. The world is falling apart. Well, if you believe what you see on the internet, or what analysts say, you would think that the world is falling apart. And look at the headlines that you encounter. You know, first, we see war and death in the Ukraine. News and other reports of people talking about climate change leading to a variety of catastrophic events. And we've seen repeated stories about democratic backsliding both in the United States and in Europe. If you delve further and look at those who study the future and make predictions about what's going to happen, there are a number of predictions about what the world's going to be like in 2050. First, there's going to be large-scale food shortages and the complete depletion of fish stocks in the world. There won't be any more human internet. It's going to be all artificial intelligence. And perhaps the most disturbing kind of prediction that you see for 2050, coffee is going to become a luxury good and hard to get. No! And that means for college students, you're out there, or our children, in 2050, whether they're freshmen to seniors or others, they're going to be 45 to 50 years old. The middle age, which is so-called the peak of life, something I'm a little past, where they'll have their children in school, oftentimes their health is still very good. Really, the peak time in 2050 for that next generation, if you believe those kinds of predictions, their life's going to be miserable because things are getting worse as we go along. But wait a minute. Headlines and what appears in the media and what people talk about are generally just bad news. There's no headline or story today in the media that says over 7 or 8 billion people were not murdered today. Meaning we tend to focus more on the negative because that's what makes it news. And we shouldn't assume that things are as bad as the news might suggest. And in fact, those kinds of predictions, which you can see all the time for next month, next year, or 2050, tend to assume that there's going to be a continuation of current trends. It's an idea of linear kind of thinking that doesn't take into account the kinds of changes in the world that could happen, or how we might adapt to change those trends in the future. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is to convince you, without falling guilty to the same problems I'm going to attack, is that the world is not likely to be as bad as predicted. It doesn't mean that there won't be challenges involved for us and bad things won't happen, but I think there's room for optimism. And I'm going to do that in the following way. I'm going to look at some of the past predictions that have been made, not now, but the ones 20 or 30 years ago, that sound a lot as dire as the ones now, but turned out to be wrong. I'll also look at some of the current predictions or claims about what's going to happen in 2050 and why those might be wrong or at least overstated. And I'm going to do so in 5 particular areas or 5 claims. So let's start with the first one. War with China. The claim is going to be that the U.S. will go to war with China sometime before 1950. And if you look even at political science models and analysts who've said that, they've often pinpointed 2050 as the year of which China surpasses the United States as a global power, and there'll be a particular kind of war. The logic they use is sort of as follows: that a rising China will overtake the United States as a power. The 21st century will ultimately become the Chinese century. They use the logic that there has been a great power struggle for system hegemony or control between the greatest 2 powers, the US and China. And you can see some of the early signs of that by looking at US defense policy. The so-called Asia pivot started under the Obama administration, shifted U.S. orientation in defense spending and grand strategy away from Europe into Asia. And the scenarios that they put together or put forward that go for a U.S. war with China involve Taiwan, increasingly used now as an example following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and saying that China's going to do the same. It can be competition in the Asia-Pacific region. It can be a battle over resources. Take your pick. But the claim is we're headed toward the first major power war at that time in 2050 in 100 years. Well, let me give you a little bit of some cautionary notes. Let's go back to the 1990s and the end of the Cold War. The #1 best-selling book in a particular country, making it to #2 in the United States in the early 1990s, was a book that predicted a war involving the United States following the end of the Cold War, not with Russia, but with Japan. The coming war with Japan. A book that argued that with the end of the Cold War, the new challenger to the U.S. in a battle over global resources would be between the United States and Japan. I suppose now we could just cross this out, right? And put the coming war with China. I use that illustration as one that what looks to the future and what seemed to be likely then, now you laughed, as you should, at that kind of idea. But now we're looking for the same kind of projections about the U.S. war with China. But a cautionary note is first that China is experiencing now its own problems. And the idea that China is going to overtake the world in that doesn't even recognize that today it's experiencing slowing economic growth. It's undergoing a demographic shift to an older population, and the population in China is actually going down. And in fact, if you look at today's or was it yesterday's New York Times had a big feature article about the next state that's going to challenge China, and it ain't the U.S. India. So maybe, right? There's the next prediction. India's goal is to overtake China as the global power. So this whole idea of being obsessed with China, starting with the Asia pivot in U.S. policy, continued under President Trump and under President Biden, may not be the real threat for the future. And in fact, when we look historically at major power shifts and changes, most of those who see a war with China look at the wars and the power transitions between Germany and France. But those were, at that time, will be 150 years ago. They ignore the power shifts and cooperation that happened with other major powers. The U.S. and the United Kingdom had a peaceful transition where the U.S. overtook Britain as a global power. Even the U.S. and the Soviet Union avoided direct kind of war. Now, rivalry and competition between major powers can exist, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a war. And in fact, interstate war, unlike civil war in the modern age, in the 21st century, is an exception. Ukraine and Russia is an anomaly for wars between established kinds of states. And with US and China, any kinds of competition or escalation would have an enormous cost in trade and economically between that and a spillover to everything else. Now, I'm not making a naive assessment. I don't think China is a benign power. And I expect fully that there's going to be a competition, and I've spent much of the last 30 years researching international rivalries. So I have no illusions, but I don't think that war is either inevitable or even likely between that. So beware of predictions that we're headed for a US-China kind of war. Second kind of claim about 2050 deals with nuclear proliferation and nuclear war. The claim is that most states will acquire nuclear weapons, more will, and the risk of nuclear war is greatest in the coming decades, and therefore you should expect to see some type of nuclear war by 2050. The logic is that greater security threats in the world will lead more states to acquire nuclear weapons. During the Cold War and continuing, there's a publication called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, made up of nuclear physicists and analysts who publish every month a doomsday clock. It's a clock that's set where midnight is the witching hour of the risk of nuclear war, and they set the clock based on their own predictions or estimations of how close we are to that kind of nuclear catastrophe. It's currently 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been to midnight and the risk of nuclear war. And one only has to look at reports of North Korea testing missiles, Iran moving closer to nuclear capability, and President Putin rattling the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons to think that there's some truth to that claim. Well, wait a minute. Are we really on the brink of nuclear catastrophe? In the 1970s and the 1980s, there were predictions that there would be dozens upon dozens of nuclear weapons states. Wrong. there are approximately the same number of nuclear states now, 9 or 10, than there were in the 1990s. South Africa and Ukraine gave up their weapons. At least one might regret it. And North Korea and Pakistan conducted their first tests. Similar claims about terrorism and dirty bombs and the terrorists will get nuclear weapons haven't happened either. More than 100 states have expertise with the potential capability to build nuclear weapons. The average physics graduate from SIU Edwardsville probably could acquire or have the basic knowledge of how nuclear fusion and capability work. But we don't have that widespread proliferation that was predicted. In fact, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty designed to limit that has been mostly successful. We can cite problems with it earlier in South Africa or with Iran, but for the most part, states have kept their word not to acquire weapons, and inspections by the Nobel Prize-winning International Atomic Energy Commission of nuclear plants have proved accurate. States have been willing to give up nuclear weapons in exchange for nuclear energy, and the so-called nuclear taboo is pretty strong against using nuclear weapons in the world. I don't see any reason, for the most part, that conditions have changed. Terrorists don't necessarily have a good strategy for how to use them. The penalties for nuclear acquisition are still pretty strong, and it's hard to see, President Putin, what the applications would be on a battlefield for even tactical nuclear weapons for that. And I'm not sure that Israel or others are going to let Iran get a weapon. Again, not a naive assessment. A nuclear Iran and a nuclear North Korea may be more likely. But what would they use them for? And when? It's not clear to me that the expectation that we really are 90 seconds to midnight to a nuclear war is there. Third claim. The world is going to become increasingly poor. The problems of the global south, whether they're disease, poverty, and hunger, will only increase in the coming decades. And then by 2050, the world is going to be primarily populated by poor countries of the world, what President Trump referred to as the hole countries. The logic is for that is that those cite population growth problems, poverty-driven immigration. Some of it is rooted in racism about the inherent inferiority of those, particularly in Africa or Asia, and projections that say that there will be over 10 billion people by the year 2050. So when they look out to the world, particularly those in the global south, they see nothing but looming disaster and conditions becoming worse. Well, let's take a step back. The United Nations put forward millennial goals in the year 2000, hopefully to be achieved or at least have progress by 2015. They're pretty ambitious about eradicating poverty and hunger. I mean, you need to make progress. You're not going to do that in 15 years. Universal primary education, gender equality, reducing child mortality, environmental sustainability, a number of those kind of goals. Those who are negative don't see any improvement on those, but see those getting worse. In an assessment after 2015 and now into 2023, we still have those particular problems, but you miss the kind of incremental small progress that has been made. Progress has been made on most or all of those, and most in the area of health that's there. Data tells us that 500 million people have been lifted out of abject poverty, consistent with those goals. 30 million lives have been saved. Health indicators have been improved through the world. And most of the progress that's taken place on these goals have occurred in the smallest and poorest countries. Population estimates that have been made historically have been wrong, wrong, wrong. There's supposed to be 12 billion people out there now. There's not. There's 8 billion, but there's not 12. Chinese birth rate is dropping, and we know from demographers that when there's development in countries and you raise the standard of living, the birth rate goes down. Even in the US, life expectancy is supposed to be increasing. Now, we dropped as much of the world did during COVID with life expectancy, but the current projections, and remember I've been skeptical about projections, are that for the current generation it's going to be 80 for males. Women, female students, you get an extra 5 years. 85 for that. It's also the case that technology has and is likely to continue to increase food production, improve medical access and science, and promote economic growth. There's still going to be problems, there's still going to be poor people in the world, especially in pockets, but standards of living is likely to be better for most, including for people like us who live in the global north. Fourth, resource scarcity. It's not hard to find those who predict that we're going to run out of key resources. Oil, water, now lithium for things. The logic is that these are largely linear estimates based on current consumption levels and projected increased demand for each one of those. And pundits say that by 2050, we're going to have 2 billion people in areas of water scarcity that don't exist today. Pretty bleak when we depend on those kinds of resources, the most precious perhaps of which is water. And for years, folks, there have been predictions of water wars at different parts of the world. But wait a minute. I've yet to see anyone who's I've studied international conflict, I've been to those conferences, of anybody who can name a war fought over water. But it's always one of those, but it hasn't happened yet, but it will. It also ignores, of course, that when you have scarce resources like water, as has happened, you're just as likely to have cooperation of states to solve that problem as you are them fighting over it. And most of those have been wrong in the past. There's a famous bet by an economist named Julian Simon, former faculty member at the University of Illinois, who bet one of the doomsayers called Paul Ehrlich, who wrote a famous book called The Population Bomb. They bet in the 1980s and 1990s that the price of scarce commodities at the time, copper, nickel, tin, whether they would increase over time, with the idea that as materials become more scarce, the price goes up. Simon was betting that it would actually go down, whereas the doomsayers say, oh, it's going to go up, we're going to run out. Simon won and has won before his death several other bets to the same things. Why were they wrong, and why might the predictions about resource scarcity be wrong? They're built on many cases of the wrong assumptions. First, it assumes that the resources and the materials that we depend on today will have no substitutes. We can't do things differently. It assumes that we won't find new sources of those same kinds of resources. And it assumes that we won't have greater efficiency in the use of those resources as they become more scarce. All those assumptions are wrong, and there's no reason to believe that they'll be any more valid in the future. Let's look at issues of oil. There are now alternatives to oil. Solar. I expect my solar panels to be turned on this week. And the trend is often in that direction. For those of us in the state of Illinois, the federal government provides a 30% subsidy, and the state of Illinois provides a 30% subsidy for that. So there are incentives, thank you, my pocketbook, for solar. There's wind power. Even in the great state of Texas is the largest wind producer among the United States. So we have alternatives to oil and natural gas that are renewable. There's also new discoveries. We worried about the price of lithium and how expensive it was for electric cars and others. In the last year, the price of lithium has dropped by 2/3. It hasn't gone up. They found new sources. In China, just this last week, has reported a breakthrough in the use of salt ash for electric batteries as a substitute for lithium. Salt is a lot cheaper and more plentiful than lithium. And we know about water-saving devices. Go flush the toilet. And the recycling of water that can lead to adaptations for other kinds of shortages. Look, that's not to say that resources are of an infinite supply, but we have the ability and have shown that to adapt to those, and there are alternatives for that. I didn't say all those adaptations will be cheap, easy, but over time are likely to be occurring. Now let's look on the big one, climate change. Projections are that climate change will dramatically change our lives in the decades to come, and surely things are going to be really awful by 2050. Worst case scenarios by global scientists indicate that global temperatures will rise by 2.5 degrees by 2050. This will produce significant economic dislocations. It'll shift in the way that agriculture in a place like Illinois, that is an important part of economy, will change. And for wine aficionados, as I am, enophobes, that means California won't be the major wine producer in the U.S. British Columbia! The top champagne producers will no longer be France, Southern England. They also point that we have a number of international environmental agreements But the way they're structured under international laws, they're all voluntary. With melting polar ice caps, the world's going to be under seawater, and we'll have more extreme weather events, whether they're tornadoes, floods, snowstorms in the U.S. or elsewhere. It's a pretty grim picture on climate change. But wait a minute. Maybe it won't be quite that bad. I mean, look, I'm not a climate change denier, far from it. But there are adaptations that will blunt the impact of climate change. The shift to electric vehicles is really accelerating right now. In today's or yesterday's New York Times, they're talking about within a couple years, half the vehicles made now in the largest car market in the world will be electric. That's China. The U.S. is moving into that kind of direction as well. Other kinds of new technologies to lessen pollution and other carbon emissions are there. People will adjust, as they have for generations, where and how they live in response to warming temperatures. And for those of you who worry about political constraints and limitations, they're there. There are climate change deniers, but I've noticed, and this is good for our people who study communications, rhetoric, and propaganda, I've noticed a shift over time in the way that certain political figures, particularly in the United States, from the conservative end of the political spectrum, talk about climate change. Early on, they said, there is no change, and denied that the climate change even existed. Then, after a year or two, there was a shift to say, well, there has been a change, but it's natural. So they became complete deniers to partial deniers. Then they said it's mostly non-human change. So it's not natural, but it's not cyclical, but it's occurring, but it's not us. Then they now say, and I'm talking about people like Senator Ted Cruz and others, who said, yeah, humans are part of that change and responsible, but we don't know what percentage comes from humans, so we can't do anything. Now, they've accepted that human change is a significant factor, and most recently, many of them have actually accepted both human behavior as part of the change to advocating adaptations. So they're not necessarily saying you're not going as far on the political spectrum as to making dramatic kinds of changes, but saying we just need to adapt. That's a big change politically and philosophically from where they were 10 or 20 years ago from that. It may not be where I think they should be, but much more open to doing something. Look, the world's going to be warmer, but it won't necessarily be a disaster as badly as we thought. Look at the past in the United States population changes and how people have adapted with air conditioning, where they moved, other kinds of actions that have occurred for that. That can happen again. So I'm not dismissing climate change, far from it, but I also think that there's a lot of room to adapt for it. The bottom line from going through 5 of those kind of predictions is that challenges are going to remain in the coming decades, and undoubtedly there's going to be new ones that I haven't mentioned and we haven't really thought of yet. I think the doomsayers, though, are likely to be wrong because they underestimate the ability of humans to adapt and change. What's interesting is that public opinion surveys, particularly among youth, in places like Kenya, Indonesia, and various other parts of the world are optimistic about their future. That's sort of the opposite in many cases of the United States. People in the United States are much more pessimistic about the future than others. So the United States is the exception. So if you're thinking about how the youth are discouraged, not in the rest of the world. In many ways, I'm partly optimistic because I have some faith in the younger generation. If we believe life expectancy, I'm not going to be around in 2050, unfortunately. But the next generation will. And if you look at some of the characteristics of that college-aged kind of generation, they have a greater responsibility to act. But at the same time, they have more understanding and acceptance of climate change and environmental concerns than those of the older generation. The younger generation also have a greater concern for human rights and the tolerance of others in addressing certain kind of problems. And I also think that they're better equipped to deal with a globalized, interconnected world than we were from the kind of education and experiences that we had. We can look at the world as a glass that's half empty or half full. I've tried to give you a little bit about how maybe it really is half full and that we don't just pay attention to the part that's empty. But I think for the younger generation, they have the possibility to take the water that's there and make it more than half full for that. And I think that, to me, is the most optimistic thing about the future, that we're not fated to that, but we have hope in that new generation to maybe get it to 3/4 kind of full. And so that's my kind of view for the future. Not necessarily going to be rosy, but the idea that the world is becoming a miserable place for everyone is really unlikely to be fulfilled. And I think that's my prediction for the future, but more than anything else, it's my hope. So thank you very much.
Okay, if anybody has questions?
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm from Ukraine.
Okay.
And I spend a lot of time listening to political commentators and analysts in Ukraine. And I'm really fascinated by how similar what they say is to what you've been saying in this talk, both in the content and in the mode of delivery.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, on the subject of the very inflated China threat. It's just so similar. And it's even a weird experience for me to hear what you were saying in English and not in Ukrainian.
Yeah.
So it's very, very refreshing approach. And it's exactly what you said, in that people in other parts of the world are not as pessimistic. So to what do you attribute this endless doom and gloominess of Americans that is one of the most striking features of discourse, both on the political left and on the political right in the United States?
Oof. Why don't you give me a hard question? I'm not sort of sure, but when one looks at political kinds of appeals, and we have communications experts and people who understand that better than I do, but I'm also teaching a class on ethnic conflict at the moment, and lots of kinds of negative kinds of appeals, blaming others and things like that, has political value. The more optimistic kind of assessments, particularly in the area of social media, I think have less appeal. I think President Obama was elected in part with that kind of positive appeal, but I'm not sure that has the same kind of resonance that it's had in the past, and blaming others, being negative in others, I think has a certain kind of element to that. And in political science, we often talk to that about outbidding, which means that politicians are encouraged not only to emphasize some negative, particularly about others, but to have the rhetoric and the appeals that are more negative than those who are potentially their things. Sounds like a political statement, but well, so be it. If you look now, you can see someone like Governor DeSantis trying to outbid Trump on a number of different kind of dimensions for that, on the negative kind of things, rather than pushing the positive kind of views and things like that. I don't think that's necessarily, though, unique to the United States or some of that. I think you can look at the appeals of President Modi in India about some of the things that he says and emphasizing that. I would like to see something a little bit more positive, but I'd also think that when politicians do that, they need to deliver. And I think if you're negative and blaming others, you don't have to deliver sort of as much. If you're positive, you sort of have to kind of do that. But again, I think, look at this. And I'm biased because I said, look at my local newspaper in Illinois. All they do is, all their stories are on from the police blotter, because they don't have enough journalists, seriously, to do that. They consolidate in a lot of things, and so where do they get all their stories? And counted online, 8 of the 9 stories they had lead there were somebody was robbed, somebody was killed, somebody was raped. We don't necessarily, in some cases, get some of the better kinds of things, and it's not news. Behind you.
Mine is related more to what they talked about in here, where it said that you are an expert in regards to the causes of war.
Yes.
And so, if you look back at, say, a large bookshelf of history books, right? There's a lot of war, and then, of course, there's
Not really, though. Most of the time, there's not.
Okay. I mean, my dad has a lot of books. There's a lot of ones about war in there.
Right.
There's, but the question is, do you think that it's a possibility, maybe, that I guess I'm hopeful. Maybe there's some sort of an evolution or something that can happen where we stop, and I liked where you were talking about, if you're looking at scarcity of resources and you start focusing, on that. But there seems to always be something, going on. There's some sort of, whether you want to call it a war or a domestic disturbance or a this or a that, an invasion or a something. There's somebody hitting somebody with something often.
But there are lots more books, though, on one of my other interests, which is peace. What those books and some of my own research says, if you look at the incidence of war between two countries, it's become increasingly rare. Since the end of the Cold War, war between countries, you have Ethiopia and Eritrea, and now you have Russia and the Ukraine twice. But for the most part, you don't have widespread interstate war anymore, for the most part. Some people call it even almost obsolete. And when you look at most countries in the world, they're not fighting each other in a war against another country. Now, one of my research that I've done for 30 years now is on international rivalries. There are still international rivalries: India, Pakistan, Israel, and some of its neighbors. U.S. and now Iran, North and South Korea. There's lots of those kind of rivalries, but for the most part, they haven't quite escalated to war. They have a number of pernicious kind of outcomes and things like that. But I think we've avoided some of the worst there. Now, having said that, internationalized civil wars have gone up, and I consider them much more of a problem for the future of war and the current war than others. These are civil wars broken out in places like Yemen, in Syria, Somalia, what's today, Sudan. More people, somebody pointed out, more people, deadlier war in Sudan than there is between Russia and Ukraine. Those, I think, are the ones that are the real, in many cases, risks, and the ones that we haven't necessarily solved that particular problem kind of for that. So I don't really think, I think the conventional kind of big wars that we think of are not that common, and I can't say we've solved it really, but not there. I think the real test is wars within states, particularly that, in that.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about, so I got family in Armenia, right? they're having conflicts with Azerbaijan, but since
Yep.
Ukraine's bigger, they get the attention by the media.
Yeah,
But I
if
didn't-
fewer people have died over Nagorno-Karabakh
Yeah,
than
there's
others.
a little crossing that's blocked off. People were finding food and supplies. Trying to keep it. That's tough. I've been down there. But it's the leftovers from the former republics.
Yeah.
Part of everybody's busy with bigger things.
Right, no, yeah, and there have been several clashes, people have died. We haven't quite gotten to the full-scale kind of war, but that's one of those other kind of problems. We haven't solved the problems, but we've kept sort of the worst of the symptoms of those under control.
But like when they buy weapons from each other and their friend, the enemy, and the friend buys the weapon from the enemy, I don't get it. It's the geopolitics thing that's kind of like,
But you can see a lot of that in the Syrian war,
Yeah.
right? You know, the Kurds are fighting the Assad government in Syria, and so is Turkey as opposed to the Assad government in Syria. But Turkey's also fighting the Kurds. So what you're saying is the old phrase, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, doesn't work in a lot of those kind of places. There's all these kind of cross kind of references and things like that.
and when I talk to people there, it's like, we want to be more Western, but then there's like a little Russian influence still. Are they our friends? Are they helping us? But when we talk to like the French government, they're send delegates, they don't do nothing. But, what I saw is a lot of people dying and a lot of churches being destroyed. And, the general media, unless you follow it, right, you won't even know what these wars are or these small conflict areas, but you will hear about the big ones because that's what the big media will let you know. China, Ukraine, is that a testing ground for bigger wars?
Right. Well, you know, but there are different kind of levels. One of the things I say to my students in that conflict class is some of the data sets and things I work on will show that around the world there are 500 or 600 ethnic groups at risk in the world. At risk sort of means oppressed, targets of violence, etc., meaning things are not quite good for them. Very few of them involve currently large-scale ethnic wars at the moment. So, for the most part, we have lots of problems. But just because they're not in large-scale ethnic wars doesn't mean that there's not violence. Doesn't mean that there aren't problems for those. And we can't call them, as something I've criticized, calling them peaceful. Don't tell the Uyghurs in China that that's at peace because there's no large-scale war against them. No, not even close. Or to tell those in Myanmar that because there aren't the requisite number of deaths among the Chin or the Karen or the others, right? I think there are lots of those kind of problems that fall under categories of human rights that involve different kinds of violence, but they don't necessarily rise to the level of the so-called traditional civil wars that you see in the Yemens and now in Sudan and things like that. So that's not, I think it's good that we're not having any at that level, but I don't in any way want to diminish that those other issues are not important or there's not other kinds of human rights violations that occur. Yes.
So I am struggling with not being doom and gloom.
Yeah.
So I was glad that's why I stayed. I wanted to hear what you had to say. But also, I read a lot, and history repeats itself. Like when you showed the bomb, okay,
Yeah.
terrifying, slavery, Holocaust. I'm not saying things aren't bad and things can't happen, but how do I go forward with optimism when these terrible things have happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think genocide and the risk of it is a real problem. That glass is definitely half empty. but I'm saying things that I don't fully necessarily even buy into, but I want to give you at least the positive kind of part. But now, since the Holocaust, and particularly since Rwanda and Bosnia and others, there's a recognition of what genocide is. There's a willingness by many countries in the world to speak out and take action kind of against it. We've come a long way from that. There's not to say that genocide is not taking place against the Uyghurs and others, or the Rohingya, things like that. But measuring progress throughout kind of human history, we've come a long way on recognizing, putting that within international law, willing to take actions, creating international courts to hold those responsible. Is it perfect? No. But if you want to look at it sort of that way, for that.
But I mean, in the future, there could be something we're not even thinking about.
I think that's right.
That's what scares me.
Right, but yeah. But it's kind of, like I said, there will be other kind of challenges or problems, and governments and people find new ways to commit atrocities for that. But this is one thing to think about. What I say though is human rights violations are a serious problem in the world, but now most of them take place, if possible, outside of public attention or publicly or in the media. They still take place, but it used to be that you tortured people in public. Anybody, my favorite line is, everything international relations and things is a Mel Gibson movie. So if you like the Mel Gibson movie Braveheart, things like that, they torture people in public and things like that. Well, that doesn't really happen anymore because they can't necessarily do it in public. There's a recognition that it's against international norms. Others will condemn them. Others will take kind of action against them. So it still occurs, but we're moving, I think, in that kind of right direction. I don't want to fall trap to making predictions about the future that I just said were terrible, right? We're getting. I think there's rooms for understanding that we haven't solved our problems, but we have made some progress in certain kinds of ways for that. Again, or do we have somebody else?
Yeah, going back to what you discussed, the water issues. So like living in Phoenix for a while, right? It's sprawling Las Vegas. I'm like, why? It's like there's no water, and then he said the states might agree to sell water, which they already do from the mountains, runs off to
Colorado
California.
River, yeah.
It's like it could get very nasty if there's ever a situation where Colorado says, "Yeah, I'm not going to give you Arizona some water." It's the river goes through my state first.
But think of the adaptations and things that people use a lot less water than they used to. Low flush toilets now are standard or mandated. I mean, there are other kinds of things. I'm not saying there aren't going to be challenges from those kinds of water things, but we built other kind of water saving kind of devices that can do things that I think will diminish the severity of the particular problems kind of in the future on adaptation. A friend of mine sort of wrote this book now 20-some years ago on ingenuity. And ingenuity is something that, given kind of a problem, leads us to think differently and adapt to certain kinds of problems and take different kind of actions. He was maybe a little bit over too much faith in ingenuity and how that can solve all sort of problems. But there's a lot there on kind of how things are done. And so I think there are certain kinds of water issues. I think they're more serious in other parts of the world than they are, particularly in the U.S. And climate change is going to exacerbate some of those. But there are things that can be changed and can adapt to deal with some of those.
Like you mentioned, the solar panels, really quick, that you're installing it. I agree with the tech, but then at the end of the day, if the panel breaks or something, where does that go? A dumpster or recycling?
Yeah.
So sustainability, that's the thing, but also it's
Supposedly I've got a 25-year guarantee on my panel.
yeah, but I'm saying that you send it off to some company or they do something, where's it going to the landfill?
Well, what you'd hope is they would recycle it, and as you get in time, the panels get kind of better, more efficient. We're not going to get rid of kind of garbage dumps in heaps, but I've been surprised that we haven't adapted more quickly to using some of the Japanese technology with incinerators, where you can produce and take your garbage and put those in there and burn almost anything, even burning the smoke that comes out of them for the purpose of energy and things like that, to cut back both on landfills as well as produce energy and things like that for those things. So,
Right. So I was thinking, I'm hopeful for technologies in the world of tomorrow, but I hear again through PBS, through different other channels, when there's, something recorded, an interview with somebody from a plant that desalinates water, for example,
Yeah.
right? You would think, oh, it's so simple. We desalinate water, we get the water, we need the water where we don't have it, then we put the salt to make batteries, right?
Yeah.
So we can use everything, and it's a win-win-win-win-win. But actually, I understand that in plants of desalination, then they have to recirculate it again, and it becomes impossible to transform anymore. And that kind of sludge is a yellow sludge that actually, produces bad things in the ocean, kills fish,
yeah,
and so on and so forth. So I'm hopeful
it's
for
another problem to solve.
Yeah, another problem to solve.
Right, yeah. And I think, desalination at the moment is really expensive now. Saudi Arabia, who's got a water problem and the money, has been putting a lot in that technology. Again, I don't want to be Pollyanna too optimistic, but I think there are ways that with economies of scale and development, that those things become cheaper kind of over time, that others will invest more in it and become sort of more common. And then there will be other kind of residual problems. There's no magic kind of solution to some of these things, but that's a different kind of problem, it strikes me, than complete water shortages, and you can solve that kind of in kind of longer run. Public policy and changes take time to kind of adapt for some of those kind of solutions. Almost any other kind of changes, whether they're technology or the attitudinal change that it takes to have people look or think about something differently, is not something that occurs usually in a year or two. It's a generational kind of thing.
Plus, my question was more towards, what is the hope for the future? Because for a big part of the history of humankind, there was always something else to be discovered, or some sources that are not we didn't tap into. Now it's like there's no more, west to go and conquer.
Well, there's no more territory to conquer unless it's the Arctic regions.
So, or the space, right? We're
Space.
thinking about colonizing Mars. And
Yeah, but I'm not
Moon.
sure. I'm not sure that sort of finding new territories is, for resources, the way to do that. It's to do things like finding out how you can use salt ash to run, batteries instead of lithium. And 20 years ago, lithium was nothing, and we discovered lithium. So.
Right, and if you've seen a series like The Expanse, have you ever heard of the series The Expanse? It was on Hulu or something.
Right.
In the future, whoever is tapping into those resources in planets far away is gonna be the category of the miners, the belters, that are gonna be between planets that are fighting for those resources,
Yeah, I mean, predicting sort of how, space resources, I don't know. Ask me in 50 years. And
Yes, we'll meet again.
by that time, if longevity is good enough, I'll be there.
Mine says general question. I will echo what she has said as well. Optimism is good, but too much optimism it doesn't really help and doesn't really affect the reality. At the same time, skepticism, too much skepticism, it doesn't help either.
And that's more what I was after.
Yeah. So my question is, how to be a healthy skepticism, right? Healthy skeptics. What would be the best way to? What I learned from you is to focus on a little bit of the progress. At the same time, read some books as well. Obviously, you read a lot of books. But nowadays, you said young people are very hopeful, but our young people spend most of our time on YouTube and TikTok and stuff like that. So what would be your suggestion for young people to be healthy skeptics, young generation?
Yeah, I think, here's my catchphrase for you to take home today. Optimism without agency is going to lead to pessimistic outcomes. And what do I mean by that? Is that you can be optimistic of the future, but that doesn't take you away from the responsibility to act and do things. That's where agency kind of comes in. To get the kind of outcomes that I thought would be better than the worst, you need people to be willing to take action, to invest in many different ways in moving forward in that way. But just to say, oh, things aren't going to be as bad as you think, and then sit there and do nothing, then they will. So to me, it's optimism with agency is the way to go. And that to me allows you to be less pessimistic. How's that? Preach.
Also, I was thinking about, you were giving the example of the atomic bomb. Are we afraid of that or not? Nowadays, there's discussions about so many nations being involved in selling and buying the fusion materials and so on and so forth. So maybe a smaller payload bomb can be smuggled into a country. You start a war with, blowing up Moscow or Bucharest.
Well, but you got to be able to deliver that bomb. Well, first of all, most of the trade in nuclear technology, most of it, not all of it, is under international control and is well documented and things like that. But then you have to be able to deliver it. Who has the capacity to deliver it? The terrorist group? Separatist group? All those predictions so far have been wrong about a dirty bomb or other kind of capacity. Hamas does not have a missile technology or something yet. North Korea is even limited with all their testing on how far they can kind of send it, things like that. Also, the other thing is, what do you gain by the use of even a tactical kind of nuclear weapon?
Can start.
Well, and that's what I wonder, why is North Korea, they just showing how powerful they are?
Why is that?
Like, what are they gonna do with it?
Well, I think it's primarily for deterrence.
Oh.
From both a sort of a paranoid view that they're under invasion or maintaining a paranoid view for their own domestic consumption for that. It also gives them status and things like that. Having a nuclear weapon still in the world of international politics is like having a brand new car in your driveway. Is everybody looks at it and thinks of you as a little kind of differently, kind of for that. And I think Iran's pursuit of that is much more about playing a role as a regional power than it is something that they would use against Israel. In many ways, it gives them potentially a deterrent against Israel for that. So it's hard to see how you would sort of use it. That doesn't mean you couldn't have some kind of crazy or other person, but my long ago colleague, when I taught at the University of Georgia, my colleague was Secretary of State Dean Rusk. And Dean used to say, at that time, it's been since 1945 that anyone's used a nuclear weapon in anger. And he said that 30 years ago. Still true. That's a pretty good accomplishment, I think. That doesn't mean let's get rid of all the nuclear safeguards, let's let it, right, but not bad. Not bad for that. 70, almost 80 years now. Got people who know me and say, you didn't give that speech, didn't you? Because I'm really a half empty, half full person. I'm really not, but I just, maybe it was too much thinking about the negativity and things like that we need to think a little bit more.
How about the danger in the future of people within their own democracies not believing in their own future? And they said that the Roman Empire actually fell from the inside because whatever enemies they had from the outside, they could have defeated them, but they defeated themselves from the inside.
Whew. There's a lot of historical work on the fall of empires and states and things like that of collapsing within. I just don't know enough about.
No, it's just like I'm looking at some signs in the Western world. You know, people don't believe anymore in capitalism, and they long for this idea that there should be a socialism somewhere that was misunderstood 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Chile.
I saw people from Italy, Turbana Champagne, last week, a graduate student who was like, no, you don't understand, capitalism is the worst thing in the world, while he's benefiting from scholarship from here.
You know, there's a lot of, you know, again, but that's sort of looking too far in the future. There was one of the famous books by Francis Fukuyama in 1990 said, we are at the end of history, meaning democracy has won. That's what he said. And, you know, I can't remember his latest book. I looked at it, and I joked and said it's the end of the end of history. Because he sort of didn't, you know, you sort of get it wrong. And so projecting that democracy sort of went out, but I also think doomsaying kind of too
But
much.
he's right, he was right in the sense that right now, even the word dictatorship pretends to be a democracy. So still tries to hold elections, still tries. So there is this wide belief in the legitimacy and in the sort of supreme legitimacy of the democratic model that at least you have to fake even if you cannot produce it. So in that sense, he was not completely wrong.
Right, but for many people in the world, you got to deliver, and if you can't deliver some of the basic human needs in some of these places, they're not going to support democracy. So, or provide order. So, what I always say is why in some countries in the world are military coups very popular? Even those who support democracy, it's because the democracies in Tunisia or the other promise of that couldn't or didn't deliver. And so, even for extremists, there's this great video I show my students, which is a video of some of the local leaders of Al-Shabaab in outside Nigeria. Pretty radical fundamentalist Islamic kind of views, and they take you into a village that is ruled by Al-Shabaab. And they interview kind of people. And they say, well, you know, do you buy into this? No, not. But you support Al-Shabaab here as a government? Yeah. It used to be terrible. You know, in here there was a lot of crime. There's no crime anymore. They show pictures of Al-Shabaab inspectors going into stores, making sure that the shopkeepers aren't selling expired food goods. There's order. There's no crime. People getting food. Now they have to go to prayer 5 times a day, whether you like it or not. But for those people, democracy doesn't have a lot of meaning when they've been used to civil war, when there were food shortages and others. Hezbollah had a very similar kind of appeal in southern Lebanon and kind of elsewhere, is bringing back kind of normalcy and things like that. So to me, that's sort of more the threat that I worry about, that authoritarianism can deliver kind of more. And in many countries in Latin America and elsewhere, and even Modi in India has a great support among the poorest people because they feel that the capitalist or democratic system didn't do much for them. Modi's appeal is really big on economic redistribution among the poor.
Yes, it's like in Belarus, they say like Lukashenko is a dictator, but the roads are so clean and everything is cheap and tasty.
Mussolini had the trains run on time, didn't he? Maybe. I mean, but for certain people, if that's your life in a particular village or something else like that, democratic, ideology may sort of like the idea, but that doesn't improve your particular life now. If you're a woman in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
it's a little different,
Yeah.
but
yeah, in Sicily, the Capo di Tutti i Capi di Camorra is giving free food to the people to make them believe that he is the one to distribute things, like a father.
Yeah, it's part of your strategy. Hey, this is Chicago mayoral politics, right? It's not, I mean, there's not difference between that and Kabul in some ways for that. I mean, it's being able to deliver, I think, like that. And for someone's life in a village run by the Taliban or even more extreme ISIS-K there, your life may be better off or you're perceived as such, so you're willing to put up with a number of restrictions and things like that because I don't have to worry about my family being killed. There's a job or there's food for me. It's not a great life, but better than it was. That's hard, and I think if you want to make inroads, you have to change that appeal or give them a better kind of view for the future in order to convert them.
It could be generational too. I have a Venezuelan friend, Chavez switched everything recently. The older friend of mine, I didn't even know, they added a star to their flag.
Yeah.
And the horse points to the right and to the left. But my one friend's like crazy about getting rid of that, going back to how it used to be. Because he was telling me like in the 50s, 60s, as well, it was like, oh my God, top of the country. If you look at that, the oil and all the
Venezuela.
resources they had. But then it's changed, but they still have that, there's a small population that are benefiting, not everybody.
Well, people also have nostalgic views of what the past is.
Yeah,
Well.
that's like, they
There are people in Russia who long for the days of Stalin on how good it was.
Yes, and the very popular statement is that in Soviet Union there was a very tasty ice cream, and kolbasa, the sausage was cheap and tasty. So they measure the level of life, but they don't talk about repressions and people being killed, but the ice cream was so
Yeah, okay. But some of that's true, and of course a lot of it is longing for sort of less complicated kind of life, secure kind of life.
And also, you said that you're very trustful in the new generations, that they will find solutions for problems. So 10 days ago, you were talking about Chicago. What is that phenomenon of wilding, getting out on the streets and beating tourists?
People.
Tourists especially?
Yeah. I mean, I'm hopeful for the next generation because I think there's at least in the U.S., there's a different set of values that recognize an appreciation for others in a collective good that may not be present. Now, that's not to say all of them. There's always groups sort of within that, but if you look, at least in the U.S., at public opinion surveys, there's more tolerance for different kind of groups, more understanding, I said, for environment, more ideas that it's not just get as much money or something out for yourself, or things like that. And I think that particular kind of value change is generational, and it's likely to lead to certain kind of policies and a willingness to sacrifice for others that may not be present in earlier kinds of generations and things like that. That's not to say that there are other problems with younger generations and things like that, but I think that's more likely. And I don't think that's just the U.S. In Europe and things like that, I think is sort of I'm losing my voice because I didn't use the microphone, but I can't talk behind that thing.
To me, a reason for pessimism is the lack of appetite for grand-scale projects, like building the next, I don't know, it was the highway in the 50s in the US. it was the train at some point. We are told that we have to do things individually and take action, and individual action is good, and I'm an enthusiastic believer in, I don't know, the UN mandates that you mentioned, but they are mandates without an actual funding support, infrastructure support, all of those kinds of things. And so on one hand, I'm kind of skeptical of the idea that we are drawn into saying we have to do these things, you know, put things on put the solar panels on our own house by ourselves, but then nobody else actually helps us, so we get 30% support, and we are told, you know, if we give you more than 30%, it's communist. No, it's not communist. The highways were made in America, in a capitalist country with national resources. There was a Marshall Plan for Western Europe. There was a plan for Japan to recover from the war. It's wonderful to have 10 by 3 doing little things for winning somewhere, but in the lack of that massive infrastructure, we could all have solar panel next year. We could all have working, functional, mass-produced cars that work with sustainable energies next year. We are not doing that, and I can't do that. He can't do that. She can't do that. We need a massive government, national, international plan to do that, and it's not there. And I don't see it coming.
Well, we're running out of time, I'm running out of voice. The challenge for many things, I think, in public policy, and particularly environmental, is that a lot of the benefits for the things you're talking about are longer term. And the political incentives to do things are short term, particularly in the United States or even in democracies. Okay? So a leader or others, particularly presidents and others, they want to get reelected, but even for the most part, their eye is on the next election or two. And so say the payoff for this is in 30 years. I have to be around in 30 years. I'm not running for reelection in 30 years. I won't get reelected if I push that. You know, when you throw things in like that, the long-term kind of benefits is one problem. For that, it doesn't line up with the short-term political incentives. You know, you're going to save, money in 30 years or something, but I'm not going to vote for you for that. I want my money now. The other problem, beside the short versus long-term, deals with benefits that I would call are diffuse, where the pain is concentrated. So some of the trade deals with Asia Pacific, collectively, they would benefit the United States to join the Asia Pacific thing. But a lot of those benefits we'll all get because the clothes we're wearing are even cheaper. There's all these other things, but they're little things for us. Those who work in industries are going to be hurt by that, are going to feel the pain. That's concentrated. And that's hard to do politically, to say, hey, you're all going to pay 50 cents less for the, for the shirt or the blouse that you're wearing, right? Collectively, that's a lot of money, but 20,000 of these auto workers are all going to lose their jobs. Well, if you look on the aggregate or other things, we really should do that. But politically, that's very difficult to do, and it's certainly not a sell to the auto workers, but it's not a good sell even to the rest of the kind of people. A lot of trade deals and things that would benefit people, or cooperative kind of actions, including environmental ones, are ones with diffuse benefits, small diffuse, where we all benefit a little bit, but the costs are concentrated. And that also is not politically easy to do as well. I don't have a solution for those.
Come on, you don't have.
No, I mean, a lot of things depend on visionary leaders who are altruistic and can get through things, and that's a tough ask for that. I used to think maybe when you get older and you're not going to be around that much longer, that maybe you're more willing to do that, but I'm not sure now that I'm there, I'm not sure that all the people around me are willing to kind of do some of that.
Plus, I think these macro projects were possible when the society was shifting from one type of organization to another, and there was a generation that was hopeful for something, and when you change things for the first time, that's what happened in Russia when they got from, Middle Ages society into capitalistic society, into socialist society very fast. And then, it was under the effusion of the people. Yes, let's build it for us. When they build it for the first time. But look, after 60 years, when the infrastructure starts to crumble, there's not the same euphoria of rebuilding things because it costs much more, and you have to demolish what was built and build something new.
Right, but it's easy to defer stuff and things. You've got a reasonably new campus or something else like that. But when I first started many years ago at the University of Illinois, they had some of the really old buildings. That university's been around since 1867 or whatever it was. They had some of the rooms that you had there on a 100-year painting schedule. Because it was easy, you look and said, yeah, it probably needs painting, but we can wait another 5 years. They just kind of kept going, and there is that mentality with, yeah, we probably should fix that road, but fix the potholes, and that'll go for another year. It's not that long-term kind of thinking, because it's cheaper to do things sort of in the short term. Maybe that's something about the way we behave, though. Even we solve problems the same way. Well, I don't have to fix this now, let me do this here. My last word, because I need to go. But but you have to also have incentives. So you Missouri residents, you're only getting 30% for your solar panels. It's to pay that. I hired a Missouri company, by the way, who does almost all their business in Illinois. But it would take, it would cost me twice as much, and it would take 15 years to get my money back for the solar. With the Illinois matching the federal incentives, they're paying total paying 60%. Takes me 7 or 8 years. My house value goes up almost immediately to make the money I just paid, right? But without that extra incentive from both the federal and the state, I probably wouldn't have done it. I'm not going to be in my house in 15 or 20 years to have that paid off. I wouldn't do it. So part of it is, if you have governments, you can believe in the capitalist or the market system, but you have to make it worthwhile for people to make those kinds of changes. So people wouldn't buy the electric cars unless you give them $7,500 to differentiate kind of the price. So there are things that I think you can incentivize individual behavior to do the things that you want for that. But you have to be sort of willing to do that. And so solar panels are sitting on my roof because I sort of believe in that long term. I think it's good environmentally, but I also know that, I only had to pay 40% and I'm going to get it all back.
I'm right behind you with the solar panels, and we only did it when Illinois said the 30%. We didn't do it when the federal gave us 30%. We
No.
waited till the.
Well, like I said.
And I wanted to, but I didn't
Right.
bite the bullet until.
Right, the company that my neighbor and I hired to do it is based in St. Charles.
Wow.
And they do a whole slew of business in Illinois. Because they said we do way more business here. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Guess what? So I've got to.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.